My name is Daniel Reyes, and for 11 years, I lived in a quiet cul-de-sac in a neighborhood called Willow Creek Estates. It was the kind of place people move to when they want their biggest weekly drama to be a squabble over mailbox paint colors, manicured lawns, matching shutters, a homeowners association that took its job a little too seriously. I never thought a strip of grass behind my house would turn into the fight of my life. But that's exactly what happened, and by the end of it, I learned something most people never think to check. Sometimes the paperwork that saves you is older than the rulebook trying to bury you. Let me start from the beginning. The house with the fence. When my wife Claire and I bought our home on Thistlewood Court back in 2013, one of the things that sold us on the property was the backyard. It was deep, deeper than most of the other lots on the street, and it was enclosed by a weathered wooden fence that ran along the back property line, separating our yard from the retention pond area behind the subdivision. The fence wasn't new when we bought the house. It had clearly been there for decades, silvered by sun and rain, patched in a few places, but solid. The home inspector didn't flag it. The title company didn't flag it. The previous owners told us the fence had always been there, and honestly, at the time, that was good enough for us. We had a toddler and a golden retriever who both needed a secure yard, and the fence gave us exactly that. 4 years, nothing happened. We planted a garden along the fence line. We built a small shed in the corner. Our daughter, Emma, grew up playing back there, chalk drawings on the patio, a tire swing hanging from the old oak tree near the property line. It was, in every sense, home. We paid our HOA dues every year without complaint. We never missed a payment, never got a warning about our lawn height or our mailbox flag or any of the dozens of small things the association could flag if it wanted to. In 11 years, the only contact I'd ever had with the HOA board was a friendly note thanking me for volunteering at the annual fall cleanup. I assumed, foolishly, that being a good neighbor and a responsible homeowner meant I'd never have a reason to worry about anything official landing in my mailbox. Then, in the spring of last year, everything changed. It started, as these things often do, with new leadership. The previous HOA board president, a laid-back retiree named Gary who mostly cared about pool schedules and holiday lights, had stepped down after nearly a decade in the role. In his place, the community elected Patricia Voss, a relatively new resident who had moved into the neighborhood only 2 years earlier. Patricia came in with a reputation for being meticulous, some said obsessive, about enforcing the community's covenants to the letter. Within her first few months, stories began circulating about fines issued for basketball hoops left in driveways overnight, for holiday decorations left up 2 days past the association's cutoff date, for a garden gnome someone considered unapproved yard art. I heard the rumors, laughed them off at a neighborhood barbecue, and told Claire I wasn't worried. We didn't have a basketball hoop. We didn't have garden gnomes. We had a fence that had been there longer than the HOA itself had existed. What could possibly go wrong? The letter. It came in a cream-colored envelope with the Willow Creek Estates HOA logo embossed in the corner, the kind of letter that always makes your stomach drop a little before you even open it. Inside was a notice, dated and signed by someone named Patricia Voss, the newly elected HOA board president. The letter stated, in formal and slightly threatening language, that a recent community boundary audit had determined that my rear fence encroached onto common area land by approximately 14 feet. I was given 30 days to remove the encroaching section of fence and restore the area to its natural common state, or face escalating fines beginning at $200 per week. I read it twice, then a third time, standing in my kitchen with my coffee going cold. 14 feet. That wasn't a technicality. That was a third of my backyard. I called the HOA office that same afternoon. The woman who answered transferred me to Patricia Voss directly, which should have told me something about how seriously they were taking this. Mr. Reyes, she said, her voice clipped and professional in that way that manages to sound both polite and completely immovable. The board conducted a full survey review of the community's boundary lines this winter. Your fence was found to be out of compliance. This isn't personal. It's simply what the documentation shows. What documentation? I asked. Nobody's ever surveyed my property since I bought it. The HOA commissioned an updated GIS mapping survey in January, she said. It's the most accurate data we've had access to. Your fence sits on common area land that belongs to all residents. We are required to enforce the covenants uniformly. With respect, I said, trying to keep my voice level, that fence has been there since before this subdivision existed. It was there when we bought the house 11 years ago. Nobody from the HOA has ever mentioned an issue with it. I understand this is frustrating, Patricia replied, in a tone that suggested she understood nothing of the sort. But the board has a fiduciary responsibility to protect common area assets for all residents. If we allow one encroachment to stand simply because it's long-standing, it sets a precedent for the entire community. I'm sure you understand. I didn't, actually. But I asked her to send me a copy of this survey so I could see for myself. She said she would email it over, and reminded me, almost as an afterthought, that the 30-day compliance window had already started ticking the day the letter was postmarked, not the day I opened it. I hung up the phone and stood there for a moment, the kind of stunned quiet that settles over you when something that felt completely secure suddenly doesn't. Claire found me still standing in the kitchen 10 minutes later, staring at nothing. What did they say? She asked. They want us to tear out a third of the backyard, I said, based on some map they made in January. She looked at me like I'd told her the sky had turned green. The fence has been there since the Hendersons owned this land, hasn't it? That's what the Petersons told us when we bought the house. The Petersons were the couple we'd bought the house from. They'd mentioned, in passing, something about the land having originally belonged to a farming family before the subdivision was built. At the time, it had been a charming bit of neighborhood trivia, the kind of thing you nod along to during a walk through and promptly forget. Now, suddenly, it felt like it might matter a great deal. The GIS survey. The file arrived 2 days later. It was a modern digital plat, generated from satellite and aerial imaging data, cross-referenced with the county's GIS parcel database. On paper, it looked official. Clean lines, coordinate points, a little compass rose in the corner. And sure enough, according to this map, my fence sat well beyond my property line, deep into what was marked as HOA Common Area, Retention Buffer Zone. I'm not an engineer. I'm not a lawyer. I run a small accounting firm out of a strip mall, and my Saturdays are usually spent mowing the lawn, not deciphering land surveys. But something about this felt wrong. The fence had been there since before I owned the house. It looked original to the neighborhood, not something a previous owner had sneakily moved back 14 feet without anyone noticing for decades. I brought the survey to my neighbor, Frank Delgado, who'd lived on Thistlewood Court since the subdivision was first built in the early 1990s. Frank was retired now, but he'd spent 30 years as a civil engineer for the County Public Works Department. If anyone would know how to read this thing properly, it was him. Frank spread the printout on his kitchen table and studied it for a long moment, adjusting his glasses. This is a GIS-derived boundary, he finally said. It's built from modern aerial data and parcel estimates. It's useful for general mapping, but it is not a legal survey. GIS parcel lines can be off by several feet, sometimes more, especially in older subdivisions where the original recorded plats were hand-drawn and later digitized by clerks who are just trying to get the data into a computer system. If your HOA is trying to force you to move a fence based on this alone, they're on shaky ground. That was the first crack of light. But Frank also warned me that shaky ground wasn't the same as no ground. If the HOA pushed hard enough, and I didn't have anything better to counter with, a judge might still side with them just because it was the only documentation on the table. What you need, Frank said, is the original recorded survey from when this subdivision was platted. If your fence has been in the same spot since before the HOA even existed, there should be a record somewhere. Digging into the past. That sent me down a rabbit hole I never expected to fall into. I started at the county recorder's office, a squat brick building downtown that I'd never had a reason to visit before. The clerk at the front desk, a patient older man named Mr. Kowalski, listened to my situation and nodded like he'd heard some version of this story 100 times before. Boundary disputes, he said. Half the calls we get some weeks. You'd be surprised how much land gets fought over an inch at a time. He helped me search the county's digitized property records, but Willow Creek Estates, as a formal subdivision, had only existed since 1991. Anything before that would be filed under whatever the land was called prior to development. This area used to be agricultural land, Mr. Kowalski explained, tapping at his keyboard. Before it became Willow Creek Estates, it was part of a larger parcel. Let's see who owned it. After some searching, he found it. Before the subdivision was built, the land had belonged to a family named the Hendersons, and had been surveyed and subdivided into a handful of large rural lots back in 1962, decades before the HOA or the modern neighborhood existed at all. My property, it turned out, sat on what used to be Lot 4 of that original 1962 subdivision. If there was ever an official survey done on that lot, Mr. Kowalski said, it would be filed in our historical plat archive. That's a different building, though. We digitized a lot of it, but not all of it. Some of the older stuff is still on microfilm. I spent the next 2 weekends in that archive building, scrolling through reels of microfilm until my eyes ached, searching for any record connected to Lot 4 of the old Henderson subdivision. The archive room itself felt like a time capsule, rows of grey metal cabinets, the low hum of the microfilm readers, the smell of old paper and dust that seemed to cling to everything. Most of the other people using the machines were genealogists tracing family trees, not homeowners fighting to keep their fences. A few of them, once they heard what I was digging for, offered tips on how to navigate the county's indexing system, which had clearly been organized decades ago by someone with their own peculiar logic. Claire thought I was being a little obsessive. Maybe I was. There were evenings I came home with my eyes bloodshot from staring at grainy film reels, only to find nothing useful and have to start again the next weekend with a different index number. But something about that HOA letter had lit a fire in me that I couldn't put out. It wasn't just about the fence anymore. It was about being told to give up something that was rightfully mine, based on a map that even the person who made it would probably admit wasn't perfectly accurate. Every wasted afternoon in that archive felt less like a chore and more like evidence that I was getting closer to something, even when the reels kept coming up empty. And then, on a rainy Tuesday afternoon during my lunch break, I found it. The 1962 survey. It was a single sheet, hand-drafted in ink, the kind of survey that surveyors used to produce before computers existed. Precise, careful line work, done with a transit and a steel tape measure instead of satellites. It was dated October 1962 and signed by a licensed surveyor named Walter T. Hobbs, complete with his registration number and an official embossed seal stamped directly onto the paper. The survey clearly showed Lot 4 of the Henderson subdivision, with meets and bounds descriptions, precise compass bearings and distances defining every edge of the property. And there, on the rear boundary line, was a notation, an existing fence line, marked explicitly on the survey as sitting directly along the property boundary. My hands were actually shaking a little as I photographed each page with my phone. This wasn't just proof that the fence had existed for over 60 years. It was a professionally sealed legal survey, conducted by a licensed surveyor, recorded with the county, that placed the property line exactly where my fence currently stood, not 14 feet forward of it, as the HOA's modern GIS map claimed. In the world of property law, an original recorded survey, especially one with monuments and legal descriptions, carries far more legal weight than a modern GIS approximation. GIS parcel data is often described by professionals as not for legal use for exactly this reason. It's built for visualization, not precision. I brought copies to Frank that same evening. He read through it twice, whistled low, and grinned at me like I'd just found buried treasure. "Daniel," he said, "this isn't just a good argument. This is the whole ballgame. A sealed 1962 survey with monuments described on the boundary, showing an existing fence at that exact line? That predates your HOA by almost 30 years. If they try to argue their satellite map over this, any surveyor, any judge, is going to laugh them out of the room." Building my case. I didn't want to just show up to the next HOA meeting waving a piece of paper and hoping for the best. I wanted this airtight. I hired a licensed land surveyor, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Priya Anand, to come out and do a modern boundary survey of my property, specifically comparing my existing fence line against both the 1962 survey and the current recorded legal description of my lot. She spent half a day out back with her equipment, her assistant holding measuring rods at various points along the fence while she took readings with a total station. A week later, her official report landed in my inbox. Her conclusion was almost anticlimactic in its simplicity. My fence sat, on average, within 4 inches of the boundary line described in the original 1962 survey and consistent with the legal description still on file for my parcel today. 4 inches. Not 14 feet. The kind of minor variance you'd expect from a wooden fence built by hand decades ago. Not evidence of some brazen 14-foot land grab. Priya's report also included a pointed professional note, stating that the HOA's GIS-based boundary audit appeared to rely on generalized parcel data that was known to contain significant positional inaccuracies, and recommended that any boundary dispute be resolved using recorded legal surveys rather than GIS estimates. I now had 3 things in my folder: the original 1962 survey with the fence explicitly marked on the boundary, a modern licensed survey confirming my fence matched that boundary within inches, and a professional written opinion explaining exactly why the HOA's map was the wrong tool for the job. I made copies. I made backups of the copies. And I requested to be added to the agenda for the next HOA board meeting. The meeting. The meeting was held in the clubhouse at the center of the neighborhood, a beige building with a conference room that smelled faintly like chlorine from the attached pool area. About a dozen residents were there, some for my case, some just for the general business, and the 5 HOA board members sat behind a long table at the front, Patricia Voss seated in the middle like a judge presiding over her own courtroom. When my turn came, I stood, laid out my folder of documents on the overhead projector one at a time, and walked through it calmly. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The paperwork did the talking. I explained the history, how the land had originally been platted in 1962, decades before Willow Creek Estates existed, how the fence had been marked directly on that original survey as sitting on the boundary line, and how a brand new licensed survey confirmed my current fence still matched that same line within inches. Then I held up the HOA's own GIS-based audit and calmly noted that it was, by definition, an estimated dataset never intended for legal boundary determination, and that the licensed surveyor's written report specifically flagged this limitation. Patricia Voss's expression shifted through several stages during my presentation. Polite skepticism, quiet concern, and finally something that looked a lot like the color draining slowly from her face. One of the other board members, a retired schoolteacher named Ruth, actually leaned over and whispered something to Patricia, and I caught just enough of it to hear the word recorded and seal. A resident near the back, a man I recognized from the annual fall cleanup, raised his hand and asked whether the HOA's GIS audit had flagged any other properties along the retention pond with similar encroachments. Patricia hesitated before answering that yes, 3 other homes had received similar notices, though none had yet reached the fine stage. A quiet murmur rippled through the room. I hadn't realized I wasn't the only one. Later, I'd learned that at least one of those neighbors, an older widow named Constance who lived 2 doors down, had been quietly panicking for weeks over how she would possibly afford to remove and rebuild her fence on a fixed income. Knowing that made the whole fight feel bigger than just my own backyard. When I finished, there was a long pause. Patricia asked to see the original documents again, flipping through them slowly. "This survey," she said finally, tapping the 1962 document, "this is recorded with the county." "Officially filed and recorded," I said. "You can pull it yourself at the recorder's office. I have the file numbers written on the back." She looked at her fellow board members. There was a hushed, awkward exchange among them, the kind that happens when a group of people realize they've been standing on far less solid ground than they thought. The reversal. The board didn't make a decision that night. They asked for time to have their own attorney review the documents, which was completely fair, and I told them to take whatever time they needed. I had nothing to hide and nothing to rush. 3 weeks later, I received a second letter from the HOA. This one had a very different tone. It stated that, following legal review of the historical survey documentation I had provided, the board had determined that the fence in question was, in fact, positioned along the legally recorded boundary line of my property, and that the previous enforcement notice was rescinded in full. The letter went on to note that the board would be updating its internal boundary reference materials to rely on recorded legal surveys rather than the GIS-based audit going forward, to avoid similar issues with other residents in the future. There was no dramatic apology, no admission of fault laid out in bold letters. HOA letters rarely work that way. But reading between the lines, it was clear. They knew they'd made a mistake, and they knew that mistake could have caused real harm to a family that had done nothing wrong. A few days later, I ran into Patricia Voss at the mailboxes. She was more subdued than I'd ever seen her. "I want you to know," she said, "the board takes these things seriously. We were relying on data we believed was accurate. I'm glad you were able to clear it up." I told her I understood. Technology makes things easier most of the time, but it isn't a substitute for the real paper trail, especially when it comes to something as important as where one person's land ends and another's begins. She nodded slowly. "For what it's worth, not many people would have gone as far as you did to prove it." I told her about Constance, the widow 2 doors down, and asked whether the board would be reviewing the other properties that had received similar notices. To her credit, Patricia said she'd already asked the HOA's attorney to review all 4 cases using the same standard, rather than requiring each homeowner to fight their own individual battle from scratch. A few weeks later, Constance stopped me in her driveway to thank me, tears in her eyes, telling me she'd spent nights lying awake wondering how she'd ever afford to move a fence she couldn't have moved even if she'd wanted to. It was a strange, quiet kind of satisfaction, knowing that digging through 60-year-old microfilm for my own sake had ended up protecting a neighbor I barely knew. What I learned. Looking back on the whole ordeal, a few things stick with me. The first is how easy it would have been to just believe the official looking letter and start tearing down my own fence. The HOA's notice came on nice letterhead, cited a boundary audit, and threatened escalating fines. Plenty of people, faced with that kind of pressure and that kind of language, would have folded immediately rather than risk weeks of fines piling up. I don't blame anyone who would have. It's intimidating to get a formal letter telling you that you're breaking the rules on your own property. The second thing I learned is that modern convenience isn't always modern accuracy. GIS mapping tools are incredibly useful for a lot of things: city planning, utility routing, general visualization, but they were never designed to replace a licensed, recorded legal survey when it comes to determining exact property boundaries. Anyone dealing with a similar dispute should always ask, is this map a legal survey, or is it an estimate? The third thing, and maybe the most important, is that old records matter. That 1962 survey sat quietly in a microfilm archive for over 60 years, waiting for someone to actually go look for it. If I hadn't pushed past the frustration of being told no by a stack of modern paperwork, and instead trusted that there might be something older and more accurate buried in the county's history, I might have lost a third of my backyard for nothing. My daughter Emma still has a tire swing hanging from that old oak tree by the fence line. My garden is still there. The shed is still there. And every time I walk past that fence now, I think about Walter T. Hobbs, a surveyor I never met, working with a transit and a steel tape back in October of 1962, carefully marking down exactly where that boundary belonged, never knowing that more than 60 years later, his careful ink lines would end up saving a family's backyard. If there's one thing I'd tell anyone facing a similar situation, it's this: don't just accept the first piece of paper someone hands you, no matter how official it looks. Ask questions. Dig into the history. Sometimes the truth isn't hiding in a satellite image. Sometimes it's sitting quietly in an old filing cabinet, waiting for someone patient enough to go find it. And sometimes, the strongest thing you can do isn't to argue louder. It's to bring better proof. These days, when new neighbors move in down the street, I sometimes tell them the story over the fence line while our kids play together in the yard. Most of them laugh, shake their heads, and ask if I still have copies of that old survey. I do. I keep them in a folder in my home office, right next to the deed to the house, because you never know when the past might need to speak up for you again. Some fights end with a trophy or a headline. Mine ended with a quiet stack of paper, a 60-year-old signature, and a backyard that stayed exactly the way it was always meant to be.